So disadvantages are independent reasons to reject the F. It is a primary tool for the policy weapon framework, right? We have critiques, which are methodological questions and statements for off-case. The other major classification is disads. And then disads should function independently of other strategies that are being deployed, right? So you're running a lot of arguments based off of a major reason, and the major reason is a disad. So for example, a counterplan, you're reading the counterplan so that your disad doesn't link, right? You're not reading the disad for the sake of the counterplan, you're doing it vice versa. So really the debate should be centered around the aspect of the disad if you are choosing to run this type of argument. And the important thing to note about disads as opposed to other forms of argument is that it requires a level of uniqueness that is independent from case. And I'll go into this a bit more, but if you are making arguments that on a disad that you agree with parts of case, that is not a disad. What you are doing is you are just listing arguments that should be made on case. If you do not need to control the directionality of uniqueness, if that is already given to you by the affirmative, let's say the economy, they say the economy's up. If your disad uniqueness says the economy is up, it is no longer a disad. The links are just turns to case, and the impacts are the exact same. You do not need to repeat the uniqueness and the impacts of an advantage. The link is what the argument you're trying to make. However, if you are trying to make a statement about, say, the state of consumption of oil for round 1, right, and that is not given in the 1AC, and you need to provide that status quo analysis, that is when a disad becomes a full-fledged argument. So the general structure of a disad contains 5 parts, and the first 2 usually get combined into the same argument. So the uniqueness is how the status quo world exists. It is a statement / debatable fact about the way in which the world is progressing. All right, the economy is up, the economy is down. Relations are good, relations are low. Oil consumption is high, oil consumption is low. These are statements of uniqueness. Okay? The brink is how fast the status quo will change, or a time-limited status of the status quo. So for example, you can think of instances in which you know the world is going to change. For example, you know that in the next 2 weeks, the Federal Reserve is going to auction off a massive amount of federal debt, okay? You know that that is coming, and therefore it is a brink. So, sorry, was that a hand? No? Okay. You can also think about this in terms of like bills passing in Congress. You know that a bill is up for a floor vote in 2 weeks, right? So, and it's going to pass or not pass, whatever, it doesn't matter. There is a time frame for which your status quo exists, as opposed to just making a blanket statement, the economy is up, and we're pretending that it continues like that indefinitely. The brink analysis provides time frame analysis for your status quo. Brinks make disads much, much more powerful because it provides a lot of probability to your argument. Then you have the link, which is just why the plan changes the status quo, right? Obviously the plan is using some level of fiat to mandate some kind of change. You're just saying that change, does something, right? And then the internal link is just why previous changes cause other sequential changes. Lots of times, there's just multiple layers of links, right? Like, we don't get from, you pass HR Bill 731, which is federal funding for, $10 million for algae biodiesel, whatever, And all of a sudden we're at resource wars, right? There has to be a sequential level of argumentation that has to determine how we get away from oil, how that causes us to be more invasive in certain instances, etc., etc. All of those arguments that lead to the final impact are usually considered internal link analysis. But the link itself is the hard delineation between how the plan changes your uniqueness. Do not confuse this with internal links. Internal links do not change the directionality of uniqueness. Internal links are just sequential arguments you need to get to the impact. And then obviously there's an impact, why we care, why we vote. Lots of these, we can go into that later, but should be fairly intuitive. Alright, so for example, here's a resolution. The United States federal government should significantly expand security at airports. The plan is the United States federal government will purchase and deploy 150,000 body scanners to airports across identified critical airports. Whatever. We put body scanners everywhere. The wording could probably be better. Example of this ad without any warranted analysis would be uniqueness of the economy is improving, right? The link is the plan spends a lot of government money on airport scanners. And the internal link is that governments will have to cut back on social programs to fund plan. Okay, you'll notice the internal link has nothing to do with the level of uniqueness the economy is improving, right? Therefore, it is an internal link. And once social programs are cut, social programs are important. Okay, this is super just generic and very bad disad. But it contains all of the necessary structural parts for a cohesive argument. It provides claims about the status quo, doesn't provide much warrant other than the link level. And then it also provides an impact as to social programs mattering. Okay, so a couple things to note here. Things that you should be aware of. If you are reading uniqueness and the affirmative is agreeing with your uniqueness, your link is just a turn on their argument, all right? If they say that spending lots of money is good, right, for whatever reason, you are saying spending lots of money is bad, right? So it's a link turn. Right? In order to control the directionality of a link, you have to control the directionality of uniqueness. This will probably be covered a bit later, but just so everyone's on the same page, if the economy is not improving and I spend a shitload of money and make it worse, is no longer a unique argument. It just becomes a linear disad. And in general, right, that is not something that is really a voting issue in debate. Most of your arguments have to be unique in order for there to be a warranted reason to vote for you. So, tips on developing a good disad. Multi-layering. Okay. In general, everyone gets the intuitive uniqueness argument. You know, economy is improving. But multi-layering uniqueness is super important. Instead of let's just saying the economy is improving, let's isolate specific parts of the economy that are improving, right? Then when I get to my link analysis level, I can isolate different links based on different parts of the economy. So if you make your uniqueness super broad, your links are going to be super broad as well. And you're going to get less traction for being able to make this a cohesive argument. Again, you can provide several links. For example, there are a ton of reasons why Republicans hate taxes, like just on a methodological level. It does a variety of things they don't like. Provide all of them, right? Because it only takes, you know, risk of link and risk of uniqueness to complete these type of arguments. It doesn't require, what people get into trouble with is they make very generic disads and very generic levels of link, and the app gets up and says, whatever, no link, we don't, you know, affect the link that much. But if the more specific you are and the more isolated your link scenario is, the much greater probability they're going to be stuck with that argument and be forced to weigh their advantages against it. Internal links need to be logical. There is a large part of this community that just skips internal links, which are just perplexing to me. To get from global warming to ocean acidification is literally like 13 internal links. Like, so many things have to occur in order for, like, the world to die. It is preposterous, okay? But time and time again, everyone just is able to get there, and at the end of the debate, I'm left with, you know, extinction for everyone versus, you know, like, massive civil war in the Middle East. Like, great, you know, I just became a race to the bottom for impacts. You don't really want that to be happening. What you want to be happening is links that isolate to a very specific scenario, because then there's a much greater probability that your disad is cohesive, right? If you are able to make a specific impact scenario, chances are you have good uniqueness and you have good links. If you're super broad, your impact is going to be like, solving just, general human lives. Like, we prevent some war somewhere in Africa at some other point in time by supporting peacekeeping operations, right? You're going to be able to be like, no, here's a scenario for Congo. No, here is a scenario for Sierra Leone. Like, this is why that scenario matters. And that is going to be much better than, just a general broad stroking, because it's going to allow you to isolate different strategies. And so, by that, I mean, my next point for disads should be chosen and run strategically. Do not run disads just because they are an off-case argument, right? This is just like topicality. In general, you're reading T to get things like links to disads. So you can get links from We Meets. I don't know if Alex has given his answers to T lecture yet, right? But if people are making arguments about how, you need intervene to be boots on the ground, right? And, militarily presence in Syria or something like that to get your disad for how Saudi Arabia is going to react to that, you should run the topicality on intervene. Why? Because the We Meet just became your link. Also, make sure your disads don't link to the counterplan. I see this happen quite frequently, actually, which is kind of surprising to me, without actor counterplans. People will read like multiple disads they were given during prep, and like there's just not a cohesive strategy to what's being said, because one disad will contradict the counterplan. Like you will literally read a disad against your counterplan, but one of your other disads does link to the does delink the counterplan. So just choose your disads wisely. It's part of a greater strategy. And another thing to determining whether or not a disad is good or not, just in general during prep, the warrant should be fairly apparent. Like, there should be a very clear logical step to like the kind of evidence that you would need to produce. If that is not the case, I would consider reevaluating, the level of or the weight to the disad that you're about to run. We'll skip the last point because I don't think it's really impressive. Are there any specific questions about disads or how they are run or tips or tricks for that? Yes?
Could you just briefly talk about the internal link one more time?
Yeah, so internal links...
Is that just kind of like a consequence of your link?
Yes.
Okay.
That's a good way to describe it.
Okay.
Right? It's a consequence of the link, not a consequence of the uniqueness. That's a good way to describe it.
Okay.
It's whatever steps are necessary to get to your final impact.
Got it. And you can have like multiple of those?
Absolutely.
Multiple steps?
In fact, if you're probably not reading multiple internal links, you're probably not doing it right. It's the easiest way to describe it. Yes?
Do you have any idea why people don't find the argument that you read no freaking internal link persuasive? Like, people are like, that's just defense, and then they gloss over it. Is that ever like, I don't know if you've ever been on a panel where the MG, or the MG gets up and is like, this disset has literally no internal links. And then the MO gets up and is like, well, that's just defense, it would still create a risk of the impact.
Ah, okay, so answering disads.
Question for another lecture, maybe.
Well, it is a good point. I don't know exactly when someone else would cover it either. Probably in like an MG lecture or something like that. But there are very different camps of people in the community about threshold for an argument. There are people that think that there is always the risk of an argument. There is another camp that thinks that if you prove enough defense, it doesn't meet the burden of being an argument anymore. And so when people are making the no internal link argument, they're appealing to the camp of, at some point there has to be some level of terminal defense for this argument to literally not make sense anymore. Now, with that being said, I think that a lot of times what is said is there's no warrant for that, there's no internal link for that. 50% of the time that's just blatantly false. They said something, okay? The other 50% of the time they're true, but there's nothing that prevents the MO from extrapolating out the warrant for why it is true. Now, that's super problematic because that is very different than providing a new link, okay? If the MO is to provide a new link, then the PMR would be able to straight turn the link, right? Because they would have free privilege for that. But if the MO gets up and it's like, yeah, you're right, that wasn't well warranted, here's 6 other warrants, what are you going to do? Now you have, you're left in the PMR with trying to answer that. So in general, it's just not a good MG strategy to do there's no internal link, et cetera, et cetera. What is kind of a good strategy for the MG is to couch it more in the impact defense realm. So lots of times you're undercutting internal links to minimize the rate of the impact. So, for example, in the global warming argument, there's lots of steps to get from keystone species loss to environmental destruction to extinction. If I undercut the extinction one, there's not a single good MO that I don't know. It's like, all right, I don't get extinction. Guess what? Keystone species loss, salmon, hundreds of billions of dollars, are gone to an economy and people are now starving. You're right, I don't get extinction, but I have millions dead and like a serious blow to the economy. Next, right? So, in general, those type of no internal link, no link arguments don't undercut the argument enough. There are instances, though, where there's literally no link or no internal link to the progression of argument. And in that instance, it's just usually it's a fundamental lacking understanding of how something functions. I see this a lot on econ debates. They'll be like, and this triggers this. I'm like, those two economic principles are totally unrelated. Like, if someone just said that, I would agree. Like, there's no way that, these two things can happen simultaneously. It's literally impossible. So there are times where it's that, or, affects relations with Venezuela. Literally, we don't have trade with Venezuela. This argument makes no sense, right? So there are instances where that kind of plays in. It was a long-winded answer, but hopefully you kind of peek into my mind a little bit. Any other questions? Yes?
For politics disads, what link determining scenarios are like the norm?
The norm.
Like,
That's an interesting term. I think that is more of a question of what makes a good politics disad. Each politics disad should be highly modular to what the plan is doing, okay? If the plan is affecting subsidies, more likely than not, you're going to be debating Senate politics. That's just because of the nature and the way in which subsidies are decided on and funded and where the contention is. If we're talking about social programs and stuff like that, lots of times the House matters more. So there's that. I would say that in general, politics disads are predicated off of a bill that is existing. And the reasons why or why not that bill is passing is totally dependent on where it's pigeonholed. It could be pigeonholed in committee, it could be pigeonholed in the House, it could be pigeonholed in the Senate. What's really going to make or break a good politics argument is whether you have specific warrants for why plan changes the status quo. Okay? The most effective politics disads I see are, this is a senator from Pennsylvania. You start to regulate fracking at a federal level. There is massive amounts of fracking in Pennsylvania. This senator is going to freak out and have to do something radical to win back his base for whatever reason, right? That's the kind of level of analysis that is needed. So there's no normal politics disad. The question of whether or not your politics disad makes sense is totally predicated on your ability to accurately define where the brink is tripped. I need 6 senators to trip the brink to this bill. Here are the 6 senators. Here is why the 6 senators changed post-plan. That's a good politics disad. So, normalcy is modular.
What do you mean change post ad? Like, what do you mean change post ad? Like, let's say, like the 2 Pennsylvania senators and the, let's say the representatives in that district, and those fracking districts. What do you mean they're going to change?
They're going to change their vote on whatever bill you're talking about. So, for example, let's use fracking. Why not? Okay. Topic is the United States federal government should significantly increase regulations on fracking. Plan, makes companies disclose all of the chemicals they use.
Yeah.
Politics disad is Farm Bill is going to pass now, whatever reason. The next subset of uniqueness arguments are these senators matter for the passing of that bill because it's highly contentious because of the amount of money that it spends. The link is these 6 senators, post-plan, are forced to radically reevaluate their stance because they're forced to vote in a certain way that is upsetting to their constituency. So they're going to have to swing on another bill to win back that base. They'll swing back on the Farm Bill, reverse it, now Farm Bill doesn't pass. Farm Bill is a good idea. So status quo, Farm Bill passes, post-plan, Farm Bill doesn't pass. Does that make sense?
You have to be really entrenched in that then. Okay.
Yeah, no, I mean, don't get me wrong, politics disads are they're incredibly internal link and link driven.
Yeah, okay.
There's lots of, it's easy to get the uniqueness arguments for politics disads. It's going to pass the House, it's going to pass the Senate. And it also has good brink analysis. When the floor votes are going to be, when, the whips and senators are going to do this. But triggering the links is what usually
And that's because
doesn't get
you
it.
have fiat to pass whatever plan you're doing, but then you have to talk about political backlash.
Correct.
Okay, got
Fiat extends to imagining a world in which plan passes. You do not get to fiat how people feel about passing the plan.
Okay, great.
Right.
So you need to link into that fiat and really warrant what.
Yeah, I mean, in general, your links are going to be a little bit broad in that instance, but will be isolated to the senators or House members that matter. For example, taxes, right? There are lots of Republican senators, right? Obviously, the Tea Party is a sub-base of that, right? So you can make arguments predicated off of groups of people and the way that they vote. I mean, you can also predicate, arguments off of, international law. Lots of times there'll be internal backlash for domestic things from senators from Oklahoma and the Midwest, not international law at all. So, I mean, you have to do your due diligence and research in order for these arguments to make sense. They are by far the most complicated type of disad that is normally run in debate because the uniqueness is always changing. Because people, I mean, that's how politics works, right? Bills are amended and added and all of that kind of stuff. Yes?
So this is going back to the uniqueness. So if someone is saying your disad is non-unique, are you basically saying that that's not the status quo?
Yes.
And they have to back that up with some sort of, no one can just say that's not happening. And
Well, I
they
mean, you
have
could
to-
say the Farm Bill is going to pass regardless. That's non-unique because they already have the Republican base in the House, right? You could
Correct.
say
You can make arguments that your link isn't sufficient. No, you say that it's going to pass by 1 vote. It actually is going to pass by 15 votes, and you upset 13 people, which means that you don't win the other 12 senators, which means it would never pass.
Right.
Something like that.
Yeah.
Right. So, to answer kind of your question, and Catherine and I were talking about this beforehand, was never agree with anything. There is no incentive to agree with any directionality of any of the affirmative uniqueness. It can only be disadvantageous to you, right? Why let them get away with controlling how the status quo is functioning? You're the negative. You get to control the uniqueness. And so disads are a way to control uniqueness to the debate, right? Because they're artificially getting uniqueness by just passing a plan, right? They get to fiat their own uniqueness. You do not have that privilege, so why would you let them get away with that, right? You get to outline the status quo, and to do that, you usually need disads, right? That's why disads can be super powerful, right? As opposed to just no solvency or no link arguments, because they are an independent reason to reject based on the status quo, which is like the definition of like being opposition. Like intuitively, you know, this weapon makes sense for the way your role is defined in the debate, right? Counterplans are a little tricky, right? You can think of like a counterplan being another good idea, which isn't necessarily intrinsic to a negative, right? Disads are like literally intrinsic to the position itself and the methodology of the position. I mean, I can tell you right now, I would never, I'm always, well, I mean, okay, when I prep my teams, I'm usually giving them 3 disads, a counterplan, 2 topicalities. I'm expecting them to run 2 to 3 of those things, right? The reason that I'm expecting that is I'm expecting one of those things to fall, one of the directionalities of the uniqueness to fall through, right? And depending on how that goes, then they'll deploy the other strategy, right? So there's a level of kind of picking what uniqueness fight matters for the debate, right? If the debate is about the economy, you better damn well read some uniqueness arguments about how the directionality of the economy that's completely opposite of the AF plan. Because if the AF is controlling the directionality of uniqueness on an economy debate, you are super behind. So let's.
One more quick question, Chris.
Yeah, sure.
I think I heard somebody say this earlier, but on politics disads.
Sure.
When I went throughout high school, the go-to scenario was political capital. I've heard lots of justifications for why people don't really use political capital in Parley. Do you have any?
Oh, I mean, I certainly use that as a link argument. I mean, okay.
I just don't see it as widespread as you do, like, in policy, for instance.
The reason that you see it in policy and cross-ex is because a lot of the good authors contextualize their argument in that. I mean, Ornstein is like practically God among men when writing about political capital, right? I mean, he coined it. And so he still does political analysis, right? So he's contextualizing it in the area that they want it, and so the evidence just exists for that a lot easier. That's not to say that political capital arguments aren't super useful. I think they are part of a link, right? There's always a risk of a link. Do I think political capital is enough to trigger all of the internal links? Probably not. But if there's other links that are happening along with that, like president's not on board anymore, 6 senators aren't on board anymore, it upsets this base of people, right? All of those things play into the risk of your impacts happening, right? Disads are a linear analysis of risk, just like advantages are a linear analysis of benefit, right? So there's absolutely no reason why you can't read political capital internal links on a politics disad for sure.
So now I have a question.
Sure.
Okay, so hypothetically you walk into a round and you've got, 3 disads. And your first disad, all of your uniquenesses line up, right? So
Perfect. Take the
just
links.
be as a link turn, right?
Yeah.
Don't
Perfect.
even read that as a
Do not read that disad.
Okay.
Because
Link turn it.
literally you will be reading uniqueness that is identical, and if you did your disad right at all, your impact is the same. Okay? Furthermore, if you lose that argument and you read a different impact, guess what? Case now has a new impact because it'll just extend it. Right? So if you think their argument causes the opposite directionality of what they're talking about, that's a link turn. Right? Remember that link turns only function with the uniqueness present, right? Otherwise it just becomes a no link. That's something that it will be in an MG lecture. I'm sure someone will talk about that. But if the economy is improving and the link is we make the economy better and the impact is good economies are good, what the hell is the benefit, right? Like what net benefit to the plan is there anymore, right? If we can make arguments that plan does something detrimental, then obviously that is a cohesive argument and I only need to read a link because I agree, the economy is improving and the economies are good. So here are link turns as to why plan messes up the economy. Done. Right? And now you saved yourself like 2.5 minutes of like being able to read other things. That from as a coaching perspective, that's one of the most upsetting things. It's not that you're, misreading the argument or anything, it's you're making a horrible strategic decision that can cost you the round, right? Because you literally just gave the AF 2.5 minutes of speech time, essentially. So I'm gonna go over this one and we'll just think about disads that we could run, okay? So the United States federal government should substantially increase nuclear power incentives in the United States, right? You don't know what the plan is gonna be. That's just intuitive. I hear this all of the time that I can't write disads, I can't write T, I don't know anything until I know the plan, right? That is not the way to approach formulating disads. Disads should be one world or the other, and links should be modular, and you should just be picking the links that matter. So, for this one, I could easily see prepping some kind of politics disad. Nuclear power, definitely not very popular, especially in light of like Japan and Fukushima, and also all of the nuclear waste debates that happened with Yucca Mountain, right? So there's definitely a politics disadvantage here. So with that, I would write out all of my links, right? I would write out my links for why Democrats don't like it. I would write out my links for why Republicans don't like it. I would write out my uniqueness scenario for whatever thing I'm going to say is bad, whether it be X bill doesn't pass because of this. I have modular scenarios, right? If Democrats don't like it, then I'm going to be running social backlash. If Republicans don't like it, I'm going to be running business incentives bad for whatever bill, right? So I can choose which links make sense when I hear the plan. Incentives. I definitely can have a funding disad. Like incentives require money to be, doled out in some way. Probably to corporations, if I had to guess, right? So because of that, though, I'm not sure. So what I'm going to do is I'm also going to run topicality that says incentives must be a financial statement. Even if they say in plan, they're going to give X amount of money, I'm still going to read my topicality. Why? Because they're going to have to make the we meet that they spend money. Boom, you have a conceded link, right? If you control uniqueness and you have a conceded link, you have some risk of some impact, right? Like you at least have that going. Like maybe the impact's not great, but that is certainly a completed argument. Okay. Other things that I could think of about running is that incentives in the United States is very interesting. I could definitely see possibly having, instead of incentives for nuclear power, just disincentives for something. Well, I can see running an alternative energy-based disad, right? Like you take away, nuclear power is not, well, you wouldn't need to do this, but it would depend on the way the links function, but essentially you would be running a counter plan that would allow alternative power to overtake nuclear power, and then you would make disadvantages predicated off of the construction of nuclear power plants and the mining of nuclear ore, right? So you're going to get that kind of disad too, right? So one thing that nuclear power does, in order to do that, you basically have to strip mine massive amounts of earth to get uranium and plutonium, and it causes a whole bunch of bad stuff. Specifically, it just destroys rivers, but it also causes like slave labor in the areas where it's located.
And you possibly have to lift the moratorium on the Grand Canyon because there's a huge uranium vein there.
Well, maybe. It would be unlikely. Yeah. They would most likely get your uranium and plutonium from Africa or Russia. It would be unlikely. Other things that could be unique is, nuclear power is definitely something that technology stealing is a huge issue You know, a lot of it can be used for nuclear power issues, like we see with Iran, something like that. So there's aspects to the generation of nuclear power that you would need to control the directionality of the uniqueness. You have to control the directionality of the uniqueness that nuclear power is decreasing in the status quo, right? Otherwise, your arguments are just case turns, which is okay. Don't get me wrong, there's nothing wrong with case turns. They're not disads, right? If the AF agrees that nuclear power is decreasing, and your arguments are predicated off of it decreasing and that being a good thing, you are just reading link turns and impact turns. That's okay. Just make them on case. They're not disads. Does anybody have questions about? Yeah.
So is there any point in the debate where you can just like, I don't know, concede uniqueness and then just run it as a term? Or no?
It depends. What are you getting out of conceding uniqueness? If you are...
Or you're just going to use it as like, it's a street term.
Yeah, that's fine. Remember, in order to control a link turn, you have to control the uniqueness. That's fine. So if they say nuclear power is decreasing in the status quo, you say, sweet, nuke power bad, 16 reasons. 1, uranium mining. 2, terrorists will get their hands on it. 3, earthquakes will cause shattering in the new plants, etc., etc., etc. Right? Sweet. Those are all independent reasons to reject the affirmative, not disads. Disads would be like, all right, I have to control the directionality of the Farm Bill in order for this argument to make sense, right? Or I need to control the directionality of our relationship with Russia, right? Because that's who we would be purchasing the uranium from. And if we're not good friends with Russia, it means they're going to charge us exorbitant prices, and we're going to get locked in this trade battle, and trade battles are bad, right? That is a totally different line of argumentation than nuke power bad, right?
And that's the better way to go, strategically.
Oh, okay. Don't get confused with case turns not being incredibly powerful. Okay.
But you have to.
I am one of the most horrifying things to hear as an MG is the order is case. Like, I've seen kids cry because of that. Because if you can do 8 minutes of nuclear power bad, you are probably not recovering from that debate. Like, that's just absolutely 100% devastating.
Just an entire constructive on case.
Yeah. I've definitely done that at nuclear power.
And you just
It's a
went
ton
on
of fun.
presumption? Is that how it works?
No, it's not presumption, it's disad. I mean, turns are reasons to reject, right?
Okay.
I mean,
And you just make them aggressive turns, I guess.
well, turns by nature are offense. There's a large difference between defense and offense. I see a pervasive attitude towards taking an argument that could be offensive and making it defensive. For example, let's take the body scanners one. I had a great example, actually. Let's see if I have it. Okay. So for airport scanners, we build a crap load of scanners, and you heard this ad, but no solvency. Airport scanners are ineffective at seeing threats because they have to block out private areas so you can hide bombs in like private areas, okay? Solid, no solvency. Like, terrorists will still get through. The turn, however, is that airport scanners reduce the number of people the federal government is willing to fund to run the airport because they think that body scanners are super effective. And so what happens, though, is that body scanners don't see body language, which is literally the biggest thing to isolating like people out of line and like catching people. Like, that's how they caught most of the that's how they catch most other airports, or almost specific outside the United States, is heavily with just personnel, because people can get past machines. It's very difficult to hide like physical body language to what you're doing. So because of that, it's a solvency turn, because you make the terrorist threat more likely, right? So there is a difference between just not being effective and making status quo worse. That argument by itself would win a debate round, right? No solvency would just be you don't solve as much. There's still a risk of case, doing some good, right? Disads are just a very intricate turn at usually a solvency level, but sometimes it's a link level, but that's super complicated. So let's go back to some of the other examples. Okay, USFG should militarily intervene in Egypt. Let's list some disads that probably are apparent.
Well, politics again, because of Israel.
Whose politics?
Israel and Egypt politics, correct? Yeah.
How?
Would be. Because out of all the countries that we give military aid to, Egypt's second, Israel's next after that. So we would be basically, what's the word I'm looking for? So we would hamper relations between Israel and Egypt, basically in that regard, right? Because we would be possibly putting somebody else in power that they wouldn't like. Because we would reduce
possible.
the aid. Yeah. Because they've been to war twice. It's a bad deal. Israel and Egypt.
Yes, if you want to run a relations-based disad off of Israel and Egypt, what are the parts of the argument that you would need in order to establish that? What is the uniqueness?
The uniqueness is that Israel and Egypt relations are not good at all.
Okay.
They're already on the rocks. So
I would agree. That would probably necessitate a disad as opposed to a turn, because you have to control the directionality of Egypt-Israel relations.
Yeah.
Probably not talked about in plan. What other disads can you think of? Yes?
Can you do an Iran freakout dissent?
Yes. You would have to control how Iran feels about the situation. That is true. Other disads. Yeah.
Power vacuum with extremists take over and whatever happens ends up being worse than...
So an internal Egyptian's politics disad. Yes. Okay. Of all of the three scenarios I've heard, it is incredibly and probably likely that the PMC has already decided that one of those impact scenarios is what they're going to go for, and are going to argue the opposite. Okay? So what do we do when that happens?
we've done the other one.
We just pretty much read the link, because they're already giving you the uniqueness, they're already giving you the impact. You're just switching, you're just saying the opposite of what their link is. Some other things that are probably relevant. The U.S. relations with EU would probably be very interesting in this situation. I'm not exactly sure what a U.S. intervention in Egypt would look like, but I could imagine that an EU intervention in Egypt would probably be better received and result in different links than if the U.S. intervened. So I could definitely see a counterplan with the EU intervening and then claiming specific links off of your disads for why U.S. action is bad, right? If the U.S. does it, it causes these people to get in power. If the EU intervenes, it causes these people to get in power, which is much better, right? So you're able to de-link, to separate your disad from the counterplan. And then you have a complete strategy. You have a counterplan and disad. What kind of topicalities would you need to run to secure disad links?
Topicality on what intervene means?
Militarily.
Yeah. So in this instance, I would definitely have the TB on military as opposed to intervene, because it's just going to be difficult, or actually probably military intervene is a term of art. I would also prep in Egypt. There is a funny thing with airstrikes not technically being in Egypt. There are some arguments about that. Usually military intervention requires physical people to be on the ground. Usually just... This isn't relevant. Alright, this is a MPDA topic from last year. It was like quarterfinals or something. United States federal government should substantially reduce entry barriers to non-U.S. citizens seeking H-2A visas. These are the high performance visa, or no, sorry, these are the agricultural visas. It's for immigrant farm help. So, what kind of disads would we be running here?
Public opinion?
What do you mean by that?
Like, well, let's go like politics / public opinion, like, because of Tea Partiers, they have put a big amount of money into, you know, convincing the public that it's easy to get into America, we need more security, more border security, therefore, you know, it's against what people want.
Let's call that politics, and let's call your argument a link.
Okay.
There are many reasons why this would trigger political backlash, political capital.
Right.
Certain senators have very strong feelings depending on their state. For example, Florida versus Texas versus Montana, which doesn't really have it, right? So there's lots of different things to go into that kind of link analysis. So we'll call it's a politically contentious issue, politics. What else?
This would encourage more illegal crossing because and encourage employers to employ illegally, I guess.
Okay, I can definitely see that. I think what's important though is to note that the PMC is going to control some level of uniqueness for how immigrants are either flowing in or out. So while that disad is probably useful, really what you're doing is you're providing a link turn, probably. So I wouldn't prep a full disad for it. Remember, you're doing some time trade-off too in prep time, right? Every time you prep a disad is something that you can't prep something else for. If you can just write down a whole bunch of link turns, and then if you have to fill in uniqueness later, it's probably at least fairly intuitive for some aspects. One thing here that seems really apparent to me is that the type of farming practices that are used dependent on use of machine versus immigrant labor. So in general, if you subsidize enough of physical hard labor, there's no incentive to convert to mechanical agriculture, which could be a good or a bad thing. But that definitely does require some uniqueness that's probably not provided in the PMC about farm equipment, being on the rise, which leads to more production or less production. I don't know. Depends how you want to run with that argument, but probably requires a full disad.
Out of curiosity, and when this resolution was given, because I wasn't at that tournament, how many teams just did not touch this resolution, went straight to a DQ or just saying that, you know what, we're not going to discuss this because you're making second-class citizens. That's what I'm starting to see out of most immigration stuff is it's just.
I mean, keying off the AF is certainly
Yeah.
reasonable. I mean, that is
Yeah.
a strategy. Do I know how many teams did that? I don't know.
Yeah, I just see that so much.
I went. What did I do? I went.
This was dubs, not quarters, in case you're trying to.
Oh, Dubs.
Or-
Devils.
Hmm.
I think I watched this round. I wasn't coaching in it. Yeah, I can't remember what I did for that. Oh no, I definitely went hard econ.
You went econ?
I went just super hard in the PMC on how if we don't get immigrant workers right now, these crops will fail in Florida and Texas, and then isolated specific crops that would fail, that would hurt the economy. That's what I did.
There was some baller uniqueness for that too, at the time. I remember that.
There was also a lot of preempts in mine about how H-2A visas would lead to other continuing stuff, and how I prepped a second advantage just to spike out of dehume,
Okay.
right? Because apparently on these H-2A visas, in order to get the visas in time, they were going to have to come from border towns that were infinitely worse than immigrant farms. So we had that